Hi, I am Sun-Joo Kim, Harvard-Yenching Professor of Korean History. In the previous presentations, I introduced the Tae-ch'ing family lived in Puyo, Chungcheong Province in late Joseon period, and an inheritance document, one of the 8 documents, belonged to this family. In this segment, I introduced 2 certificates of adoption dated 1721 and 1838, and an administrative memorandum concerning the 1721 certificate. Domestic adoption in contemporary Korea is rare. While for several decades in the latter part of the 20th century, foreign adoption of Korean children was very popular, to the extent that Korea earned a reputation as the world's leading baby exporter. According to a BBC News report in 2015, adoption in Korea is taboo, and the taboo arises because the importance of bloodlines in Korea is ancient and deep-rooted. As early as 1988, the New York Times pointed out that in a country where most families proudly display thick volumes of genealogical charts, where the Confucian respect for ancestors remains very much alive, there is little place for children of a different bloodline. This description of Korea from ancient time and on as a patrilineal society, which put emphasis on families related by paternal blood, needs historical verification, and adoption papers from the Joseon dynasty help us just to do that. So let's take a look at Joseon-era adoption practices to learn how accurate this popular understanding of historical roots of Korean emphasis on patrilineality. In Joseon Korea, there were 3 types of adoption: suyang, shiyang, and ipu. According to early Joseon law, when adopting a child younger than 3 years old, it was called suyang, while adopting a child older than 3 was called shiyang. The distinction was made in order to differentiate a share of inheritance. The adoptive parents accepted either a shiyang or suyang adoption for various social and cultural reasons, such as simply to raise and support an orphan, to receive care from the adopted child when old, to have the adopted child carry out ancestral rituals, to promote the family's stability by having a successor, or to create social networks with powerful people through the adopted child. In addition, such an adoption was not legally binding. A child adopted through shiyang or suyang did not have status as a dual heir in accordance with the agnatic succession principle, nor did he or she become a legal member of the adopted family. In such circumstances, a child in either agnatic or non-agnatic relation to his or her prospective adoptive parents could become a candidate for shiyang or suyang adoption. In contrast, the laws concerning iphu were framed in an effort to establish the agnatic principle centered on patrilineage. Confucian funerary and ancestral rituals became one of the major agents of changing Korean family inheritance and other practices from bilateral to patrilineal. The construction of family shrines, observation of the 3-year mourning period, and other funeral practices were key measures leading to such a change. Because Confucian ancestral worship required a male heir, families had to establish through adoption when they had no son of their own to carry out the rituals. Ippu adoption was codified in the Great Code of Administration. The regulation prohibited an Ippu adoption when the man had a son by a concubine. Candidates for an adoption were branch sons from within the same agnatic descent line, namely agnatic nephews, including any candidates in the next lower generation of the lineage, but excluding a nephew who was himself a biological first son. The regulation also excluded the man's ascendants, his brothers, and his grandsons. Therefore, parents usually selected an heir from among the male children in the next lower generation. The parents had to formally petition the state and receive official approval for the adoption to have legal validity. As just mentioned, the law prohibited an adoption when the man had a son by a concubine. However, a majority of Yangban families, in fact, did not like to make a concubine's son as heir because her children inherited her low social status and therefore were ineligible to take the civil service examinations and were subjected to other forms of discrimination. As a result, the state officially dropped this prohibition from the supplement to the Great Code promulgated in 1746. Despite the effort of the state to introduce Confucian social legislation, including the adoption law, as a way to transform Korean society, the principle of agnatic succession did not take firm root in the early Joseon period. Therefore, sons and daughters continued to divide ancestral property equally and to take turns conducting ancestral worship. Even daughters of the descendants conducted rituals. Under these circumstances, there was no need for an agnatic adoption to establish an heir. The gap between the law and popular practice was apparent in early Joseon and did not close for a few centuries. As you can see in this chart, Mark Peterson analyzed the lower civil service examination rosters and found that less than 1% of the degree holders before 1550 were adopted heirs. Even in the period of 1550 to 1700, an average of only 6% of the degree holders were adopted heirs. A drastic change took place from 1700 and on, however, where 10 to 14% of the late Joseon degree holders were adopted heirs. The practice of adopting an agnatic heir was firmly rooted after the 18th century, with the adopted son continuing the family line and taking care of ancestral rituals. This change coincided with primogeniture as well as with the formation of lineage associations and same surname villages, indicating a Confucian transformation of Korean society. This transformation affected women negatively, for they lost their equal inheritance right and were excluded from performing ancestral rituals. Now let's look at the two certificates of adoption belong to the Tae-ch'ing family. A certificate called Ib'an in Korean was an official document that a government office could issue either to verify the purchase and sale of a house, land, or slave, or to verify an adoption. The Ministry of Rights was in charge of adoption, and it issued the adoption certificate after the adoption procedure was completed in accordance with the laws. In the Tae-ch'ing family documents, there are two certificates of adoption dated 1721 and 1838, as noted in the first line of these documents. The two adoption certificates introduced here concern the same family, descending from Tae-ch'ing, marked with green box here. The two adoptive fathers, Myung-jup and Po-hwan, are the direct descendants of Yu-ham, the apical ancestor for this Jinsagong branch of the Kigeyu lineage. Yu Ham himself was originally a son of Yu Kang, but became an adopted heir to Kang's brother Yu Jin, who did not have a son. We do not know the exact year the adoption of Yu Han took place, but it may have been in the late 16th century when social elites began to accept and practice the principle of agnatic succession. An examination of the genealogy of the Kigeyu lineage yields no example of adoption before Yu Han's generation, while an increasing number of adoptions took place after the 17th century. To adopt a child, first both the prospective adoptive father and the birth father, or the mother if the father had died, submitted an appeal to the Ministry of Rights, stating their respective wishes that the heir be adopted. In the 1721 case, Yu Myung-zuk as the adopted father and Yu Myung-bo as the birth father submitted an appeal in which they stated that the adoptive father had no son from his primary wife or from a concubine, thus meeting the qualification for an adoption. Myung-bo was Myung-zuk's 12th Chon relative, and the prospective adoptee Yu Su-ak, also known as Yu Jung-gi, was Myung-bo's 4th son, which satisfied the conditions for an adoption candidate. Chon in Korea is a marker that shows the remoteness or closeness of relatives to oneself. For example, an uncle is 3 chon apart from oneself, and a cousin is one's 4 chon relative. Parents and children are 1 chon apart, and siblings are 2 chon apart. In 1721, Yu Myung-zuk was 46 and his wife Madame Jo was 45 years old, an advanced age for Madame Jo to expect to bear a child, which must have motivated them to adopt an heir. In the 1838 case, the adoptive mother, Madame Song, and the birth mother, Madame Park, submitted an appeal because their respective husbands, Yu Bo-hwan and Yu Jung-han, had both died. The appeal likewise made the required disclosure that Bo-hwan did not have a son by either his primary wife or a concubine. The adoptee, Yu Chi-jong, was Jung-hwan's 2nd son, and Jung-hwan had been Bo-hwan's 18 chon relative. In both the 1721 and 1838 adoption cases, the adoptive parents selected the adoptee from among rather distant kinsmen, a popular practice to secure a talented boy or young man as an heir. The Ministry of Rights, after receiving the appeals, had the relevant county magistrate's office investigate the validity of the appeals. The local government office then either sent out a written inquiry to receive a written response or recalled the relevant people to appear at the court in person to give their oral testimony. The magistracy then reported the results of the investigation to the Ministry of Rights. In 1721, both fathers came to the magistrate's office and confirmed the content of the appeal, while in 1838, the 2 mothers submitted a written response. In addition, a witness from the lineage needed to verify the matter. As the respective lineage has in the 2 cases, Yu Hu testified in writing in 1721, and Yu Han-eung testified in person in 1838. After receipt of the verifications from the local office, the Ministry of Rights put together the case in a report and then submitted to the king. A royal secretary handled the royal review and decision, but the staff at the ministry issued the final certificate after the royal approval. At the end of the certificate, the name of the royal secretary in charge is recorded. Kim Jae-ro, 4th Royal Secretary in 1721, Park Jong-hyu, 3rd Royal Secretary in 1838, along with signatures of a ministerial rank official and a non-ministerial rank official in 1721, and the signature of just one ministerial rank official in 1838. While the two cases we examined show an adoption of a remote relative, there were also cases where they adopted sons within the confines of close relative. For example, Yu Myung-jip's brother, Myung-jip, was adopted by his uncle. Myung-jip's son, Hwaegi, was adopted by Myung-jip's own brother, Myung-sup. In the next generation, Hwan-gi's son, Eun-gyun, was again adopted by Hwaegi. By exchanging sons within the confines of close relatives, members of the family not only secured an heir, but also strengthened the larger family's rapport and protected the wealth of each nuclear family. In contrast, there were many cases where no adoption was made, even when there was no son to be the ritual heir, even in late Joseon period. Before closing, I'd like to show one more document called a memorandum, Komok, among the Yu Tae-ch'ing family documents that is also related to the 1721 adoption. A Komok is a document that a person of lower rank wrote to a person of upper rank official to make a brief report or an inquiry. The Komok here was written by Jang Han-ik, a clerk at the Ministry of Rights, and related to the 26th and dated the 26th day of the first lunar month in the Shinchuk year, which was 1721. As you can see from this translation, we can speculate that Yu Myung-jip raised the question of why only one ministerial rank official had signed on the adoption certificate issued the day before, and that Jang Han-ik wrote the memorandum to explain that it was the norm for just one ministerial rank official to sign the adoption certificate, while two ministerial rank officials signed the report submitted to the king for royal approval. In conclusion, although patrilineal adoption was encoded in the late 15th century code, Great Code of Administration, it was not practiced until the latter part of the 16th century because Yangban elites did not feel the need, as ancestral rituals were offered by both sons and daughters. By the 18th century, however, many Yangban families filed an official petition to adopt a son to continue the family line when there was no son from the primary wife. While adopting a son from a remote paternal relative was popular, there were various adoption practices to meet different family situations. In late Joseon, two other types of adoptions, Shiyang and Suyang adoptions, in which anyone can be adopted, did continue. But the dominant form of adoption was Iphu, to establish a ritual heir by adopting a son from the same bloodline. Therefore, one can certainly argue that contemporary Korea's unwillingness to adopt a child without any blood tie has its cultural roots in late Joseon dynasty, but not any earlier than that. And the changes in ritual and inheritance practices were not necessarily and unitarily driven by Confucian ideology, but other factors including economic calculations. In the next segment of the 5-part presentations, I will introduce household registers and what we can learn from them.